So today on the podcast, we have another chunky episode with 3 segments. First, I have some updates to those stories that we explored here last week and the week before. Second, I'm going to walk you through the just opened animation courtyard at Hollywood Studios and talk about what the elements in this new area mean and how they remake this section of the park. And last, we'll talk about the surprise announcement of the week. Carousel of Progress at Magic Kingdom is being entirely redone and what this suggests about Disney's strategy for next year. So, there's a lot in those areas to explore, but before I jump into today's episode, I need to thank a few more people who have recently joined us over on Bandcamp. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast, so these here are the people who keep this whole enterprise going. I'm thankful for each and every person over on Bandcamp, but today, thanks are going out to new members, Nick, Wakanda Warrior, Lee, and Castle Keith. Thanks to you and to everyone over on Bandcamp. And now, let's jump into today's stories. So our first segment today is 3 short updates to stories that we covered last week about Disneyland and the week before about Disney World. So let's move through these to kick things off today. First, for weeks based on economic forecasts, I've been saying that Disneyland should have typical crowds this summer, largely drawing on Southern California residents who can easily drive to the park for day trips. And that is, so long as Disney offers some minor or modest promotions. And now we have our first new promotion. Starting last Wednesday, May 27th, Disney will give guests renewing their Magic Key annual pass a dining gift card worth between $25 and $100 when they renew. That is, Disney is specifically trying to incentivize existing pass holders into renewing in the hopes of keeping the parks full. If you're on the most expensive Inspire Pass, you get $100 on your gift card. If you're on the least expensive Imagine Pass, you get $25 and everyone else is in the middle. And this targets the exact group that Disney needs to focus on to maintain attendance numbers, specifically locals who plan to visit more than once this summer and into the fall. The promotion runs for a whole year, so if you don't renew for many months, you still will receive that gift card. And I'll also point out something about the length of this offer. On the one hand, making sure that everyone has an opportunity to receive this offer regardless of renewal date suggests a type of overall fairness. But on the other hand, Disney could have chosen a promotion that was more limited to summer if they thought that was the extent of the problematic period. Something like 30% off dining during summer for annual pass holders, or bring a friend for $99 on a weekday, and so on. That this first promotion for Disneyland is both focused on locals, as this is the group that mostly holds Magic Key annual passes, and on an extended period, essentially helping to fill the California parks at least for the next year, suggests that Disney is positioning itself to manage an economic downturn that may last beyond summer and fall. Second, again from a story last week. When we explored the construction on the Coco boat ride last week, I discussed how the land over at DCA for the ride had been cleared, graded, and that there was one lone orange excavator on the cleared ground, along with a couple of storage trailers, which meant that the construction project was still in the period of land prep. Those notes were from a walkthrough I did of the park and the surrounding area on the morning of Sunday, May 17th. As of this weekend, however, Disneyland has moved in more construction equipment. The construction equipment now there mostly has different uses other than land prep. There's a skid loader, a front loader, there's a hydrovac, which is usually used when working on utility lines, there's a dump trailer, which is either being used to remove dirt and debris, or perhaps to bring in gravel and other materials. There's now a new crawler excavator back there, but in a different location closer to the Incredicoaster. This perhaps is being used to begin a path area to connect the construction site, which is presently outside the park, to the park itself. Probably most importantly, there's a knuckle boom crane that appears to be laying large construction mats on the ground inside the construction site. These mats may be used as the foundation for heavy equipment, such as cranes that likely will soon be brought into the area. That is, the appearance of this particular equipment suggests that the project will soon be moving from demo and land prep into actual construction. And our third update, stemming from a conversation we had here a couple weeks ago, Disney CFO Hugh Johnston recently told investors at a Moffett-Nathanson conference that Disney parks were presently full. Specifically, he said in terms of increasing demand, we don't necessarily, without expansion, have the ability to grow attendance massively because it's already filled up. So, I spent one weekend in May at the California resort and another at the Florida resort. And as we've explored in previous episodes, Disneyland, because it relies on locals, tends to remain reasonably full even during periods of economic uncertainty. This is exactly what I observed over 2 days in the middle of May at the Disneyland resort, that it did still feel reasonably full. But Hugh Johnston's statement didn't match my impressions of the Florida resort at all. I was in all 4 parks over a few days on Memorial Day weekend, which should have been a peak travel and visitation time. As we discussed 2 weeks ago, the economic markers that I've seen, especially in terms of rising fuel prices and airline ticket prices, should suggest that even with significant discounting, which is already happening, the Florida parks should be seeing fewer guests, particularly fewer traditional families of tourists who arrived by plane. And despite what Hugh Johnson said to potential investors at that conference, I did not see the parks, as he put it, filled up. And remember, Johnston is trying to present the company in the best light possible for investors, and Johnston is almost surely and specifically using vague terms in his presentation. For example, filled up doesn't have a firm numeric definition, as would a phrase like 80% of potential capacity. To some extent, filled up is a matter of opinion. Who knows exactly what filled up means to each person? In my own experience, however, I would say that Epcot was fairly empty over Memorial Day weekend, as was, strangely, Hollywood Studios. I was at Animal Kingdom first thing one morning. It was actually modestly busy. But in all cases, at all 4 parks, it was easy to move down any walkways. Queue times at all attractions remained modest. I had a lot of room around me in every park, no matter where I was, except for the fireworks. It was nowhere near what I, in my opinion, would call crowded or filled up. The only time a park did feel a little like it was moving slightly towards full was in the evening at the Magic Kingdom, again before the parade and the fireworks. But even there, during previous Memorial Day weekends, I would say that the Magic Kingdom was easily 30 to 40% more full. I also noticed that the hotel pools that I saw weren't as full as they were on previous Memorial Day weekends as well. And so even during a period of high discounting, where guests can actually get an on-site room, say at the All-Stars, for as little as $92, and when Florida locals can get multi-day tickets that break down to $64 per day, The parks and even the overall resort in Florida, at least from what I could see, never approached anything such as being filled up, at least as I would describe that term. Memorial Day weekend felt, in terms of my internal sense of crowds, a lot more like a non-holiday weekend in February. The parks weren't empty, but neither were they full. And what I am now seeing Disney doing, both in California and Florida, in terms of the length and extent of various promotions, is preparing themselves for an economic downturn that might legitimately last beyond fall and summer and into 2027. And those are the updates that I have on our ongoing stories. And now for our featured segment. Our main segment this week will focus on the animation Courtyard recently opened at Hollywood Studios, and it is pretty stunning. And the forthcoming set of indoor animation-related experiences that are going to be put right next door to the Courtyard and will open in a few months. Earlier today, Disney released a map of what will be in that indoor space, and we'll talk about all that in a bit. But let's start here. As of this past week, Disney World has introduced a number of small changes to its 4 parks. We'll break them down over the next week or so. Let's start, though, with one of my favorites. At the top of my list is a project that initially I believed would be nothing more than a small mention on an episode like this. A project that, at least right now, has no ride or attraction or new show. And that area, for us, who are also interested in the history of the Disney studio and of animation, is the surprise of the week. The redone animation Courtyard at Hollywood Studios. This corner of the park was once home to the Magic of Disney Animation Tour, which ran from 1989 to 2015 and included peeks into an actual working animation studio. And that attraction spoke to what was, back then, the prime identity of this park, which was a place focused on how movies were made, from special effects to Foley to stunts to animation. In the late 20-teens, the identity of this park shifted from the making of movies simply to lands that celebrated the culture and experience found inside of film. In this, when the Magic of Disney Animation closed, it was replaced a few months later with Star Wars Launch Bay. This was largely a preview center or a thematic bridge to Galaxy's Edge, along with meet and greet areas for Star Wars characters, props from the Star Wars films, special effects models, and so on. Launch Bay was never a very popular area of the park, not even when Disney started having Star Wars-themed dessert parties there, and also, for at least a couple of years, a Star Wars guided tour of Hollywood Studios that included time in Launch Bay. And then, once Galaxy's Edge opened, the old animation Courtyard, i.e. Launch Bay, went from a place that only a handful of people visited each day to a place that was mostly dead. Moreover, in summer, this Courtyard was one of the hottest places in the park. A great big rectangle of exposed concrete. Admittedly, some of the concrete was white-gray, while there were also brick-toned concrete accent lines worked into it, and for shade there were a few palm trees and nothing more. Aside from that, there were a few lampposts and the usual trash cans. That is, the space wasn't especially inviting, particularly for a space inside of a Disney park. That is, until this past week. This past week, the construction walls that had enclosed the Courtyard for months came down, revealing a beautiful new space. The animation Courtyard itself was redone with a lot of brickwork, benches, a garden pergola, and artificial grass. And yeah, I know some fans out there aren't fans of the artificial turf, but I'll give you 3 benefits here, particularly in Florida. First, there are far fewer pests, such as ants and cinch bugs in Florida on artificial turf. Second, during heavy downpours, and Florida has a lot of those, artificial turf can be arranged to drain more quickly than natural turf without the water pooling into muddy puddles on top of it. And lastly, artificial turf handles the intense sun of Florida a lot better than natural grass. And at least right here, the artificial grass looks pretty good in this particular presentation. Now let me walk you through this space. The overall design of the redone courtyard is a tribute to 3 major studio locations for Disney animation in California during the 20th century. And I know, yes, that over time there's more than 3, but these are the 3 big ones. The 3 big centers for Disney animation in California during the 20th century were the Hyperion Avenue Studio in Los Angeles, which Disney occupied from 1926 until 1940. This was the location where Snow White, as well as most of Pinocchio and Fantasia, were developed. Next, the main studio in Burbank, and this is what most people think of when they think of the Disney studio, with its central animation building. Disney started to move into the Burbank studio in 1939, and animation remained there in the famous animation building until roughly 1985. This is the location for most Disney features from Dumbo and Bambi up through The Black Cauldron. After 1985, most Disney animation was shifted over to temporary locations in Glendale, mostly repurposed warehouses and industrial buildings, while the old animation building at the studio became offices for Disney executives and also for outside production companies. While in Glendale, that collection of temporary locations were the place where Disney made such films as The Great Mouse Detective, The Little Mermaid, and Beauty and the Beast. Both The Lion King and Pocahontas were started at those locations in Glendale, but their primary center of production moved as those films were being made. In 1994, Disney opened the Roy E. Disney Animation Building, which was across the street from the original Disney studio, but technically still part of the main studio campus. This was on land right around where Walt once considered building an early version of Disneyland. The Roy E. Disney Building, with its trademark sorcerer's hat rising from the front of the structure, was the location where Pocahontas and The Lion King were finished, and also at least one production location for many subsequent films, including Frozen, Zootopia, and Encanto. So here's how bits and pieces from all of these 3 different locations are arranged into the animation courtyard that opened last week at Hollywood Studios. The early Hyperion studio is represented by a painted version of that famous neon sign of Mickey Mouse, which decades ago rose above Walt's first large studio. Again, the Hyperion Avenue studio was not the first Disney studio, just the first large one. That sign features the gloved hand of Mickey Mouse waving to people who pass by, along with the words Walt Disney Studio beneath it. Most of the surviving photos of that particular sign are in black and white because that sign existed in the 1930s, but that sign in reality was extremely colorful back in its day. And so the color also shows up in the painted reproduction in the animation courtyard. Having seen a few, and I think I've seen no more than 3, color photos of the old sign, I can say that the colors of the actual neon sign were far more bright and saturated than the colors used in its reproduction in the animation courtyard, but the muted tones in terms of color give the sign a visual suggestion of belonging to an earlier era. The second and by far largest set of icons comes from the Burbank studio. This is the studio that Walt occupied for most of his professional life, and also is the studio that most of us think of now as the Disney studio. At the entrance to the animation courtyard in Hollywood Studios is a raised brick marker that says the Walt Disney Studios, just like the raised brick marker that's out in front of the guard kiosk at the actual studio today. That marker first showed up at the Disney Studios sometime around 1940, maybe a few months on either side of that date, and defined the identity of Walt's campus in a particular way. The brickwork was long and elegant, arranged in a streamlined modern design, with restrained ornamentation and a professional clean lettering. This marker signaled to the public that this particular studio was a serious, elegant, and artistic enterprise, not a fantasy or whimsical world as suggested by the films that were produced there. That is, Walt Disney, through this entrance sign in Burbank, was signaling to the public exactly how they should view the Disney studio with a sense of elegance, purpose, and seriousness. And a scale model reproduction of this brick marker and sign also marked the entrance to the animation courtyard at Hollywood Studios. Next up, and also from the Burbank studio, are the tall beige buildings that enclose the courtyard, now arranged to look like sound stages from the Burbank studio that are marked with numbers, such as Stage 1, with the same font and colors as those on the actual Burbank sound stages. These mock sound stages are also ornamented with oversized movie posters lit from above by angled lights. At the actual Disney studio in Burbank, Disney typically uses these spaces for recent productions, both for film and TV, such as the Mando and Grogu movie. The better a film or a TV project does, the longer those oversized posters stay up at the actual studio. If the projects don't do well, those oversized posters at the actual studio come down rather quickly. A few years ago, the production materials for the film Solo, a Star Wars story, came down from the studio really quickly. At the animation courtyard, however, the posters are not for recent projects. They are instead focused more on classic films, such as Dumbo from 1941, Lady and the Tramp from 1955, and Tangled from 2010, indicating that this space is more focused on history than on very recent productions. Continuing now down the list from the Burbank studio that are incorporated here is Pluto's Corner and the famous street marker. Both of these were arranged as temporary props at the studio when Disney was filming The Reluctant Dragon in 1941. If you've seen the full 74-minute feature film called The Reluctant Dragon, not just the 20-minute cartoon that also has the same name, you know that most of this film was arranged as a studio tour of Walt's newly opened facilities in Burbank, in which the actor Robert Benchley plays what I would call a lightly fictionalized version of himself who comes to the Disney studio with the idea of making a short cartoon called The Reluctant Dragon, and on his way to meet Walt and pitch this idea, he learns, along with the audience of course, how animated cartoons are made, or at least were made back in 1941. For this movie, Disney made a few gag props that they installed at the studio to give the environment a sense of visual whimsy. For Pluto's Corner in Burbank, about 85 years ago, a group installed a red and yellow fire hydrant along with the curb sign announcing that this was Pluto's Corner, where, wink wink, Pluto tended to relieve himself. And not far from the hydrant was a raised directional sign, also featured in that same movie, that showed the path to various streets and departments at the studio. The sign was arranged as a single metal pole with horizontal lines of text pointing to various parts of the Disney campus, such as Mickey Avenue, Dopey Drive, the Ink and Paint Building, the Multiplane Building, the area for special effects, and so on, which are all places that Robert Benchley, one by one, visits in the film. So in the movie, the signpost functions as a visual preview or table of contents for what the audience would see later in the film. Though these were initially intended as temporary props, they are still at the studio today and have been remade here, I believe at a slightly smaller scale, in the animation courtyard. Next, the grounds at the Animation Courtyard imitate the grounds at the Disney Studio, particularly how they existed during the lifetime of Walt. There's open green space, a lot of trees and shades, various walkways and benches. There are also pergolas here in the Animation Courtyard. There are now pergolas at the Disney Studio in Burbank, but I think these were added after the studio was opened. All of these elements define the overall landscape design of the Animation Courtyard, which means that this space pretty much imitates the landscape design of the Burbank studio. The last element here taken from the Burbank studio is the green metal perimeter fence. The Disney studio in Burbank did not always have a continuous fence around it. The first wave of real security at the Disney studio mostly started during World War II, when the studio made films for the military, including on top secret topics. But the green metal continuous fence that now surrounds the street portions of the Disney studio had its origins in the early years of the Michael Eisner era at Disney. That would be the late 1980s. And that fence then was further developed after 9/11 for additional security. But a reproduction of that green metal fence has been remade here in the Animation Courtyard, complete with the two types of decorative fence caps. Smaller images of Mickey, essentially those three very easy recognizable circles placed every few feet along the fence, and then at post markers a much larger oval outline of Mickey's head. This is exactly the type of fence that surrounds the Burbank studio, though I'm pretty sure the fence in Burbank is quite a bit taller. Now moving on to the third center of animation in California. The major element from the Roy E. Disney Animation Building, that's the building that opened across the street from the original studio in 1994, is mostly represented here with the architectural flourish of Mickey's blue and silver-white sorcerer's hat from Fantasia. At the actual studio in California, where that architectural hat is much, much larger, that hat used to hold the office of Roy E. Disney. From what I've been told, in summer it could get ungodly hot in there. A much smaller version of that architectural hat has been included here as the entrance facade for the building at the back of the courtyard, which will be the entrance to the indoor animation tour and experiences, not yet finished, that will open later this year. A good guess as to opening date for those experiences would be sometime in August, but I've got more information about this. A few days after the Animation Courtyard opened, Disney released a map of the still under construction animation experiences inside that building. It's going to be a series of small adventures, including a type of self-guided tour on the practices of animation arranged around a central courtyard. The map reminds me a lot of how the Animation Building, along with its indoor experiences at DCA, were laid out for that California park. At DCA, that building had a central indoor courtyard around which were small animation-based experiences, the Sorcerer's Workshop, Turtle Talk, Animation Academy, and various meet and greets. Some of the original experiences inside of DCA's Animation Building, I should point out, have now closed, but this was the general layout conceit of the area when it opened. And this generally is how the set of animation experiences will be arranged in Florida. After walking under the reproduction of that sorcerer's hat, you'll enter a central courtyard inside the quote-unquote animation studio, which has signage announcing that the studio is presently having an open house where guests can see how animation is made. Moving clockwise around a circle, on the left to start with will be the Once Upon a Studio Theater, which will show the cartoon Once Upon a Studio with some added in-theater effects where characters either appear or interact with things that are happening up on the screen. The next large area will be Drawn to Wonderland. This is a playground for those 5 years and under in an environment arranged in the style of Mary Blair's concept art for Alice in Wonderland. Individual subsections of this play area present the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, Tugley Woods, and the Queen's Rose Garden. Next is Off the Page. This is the area where Disney characters define the major steps in making an animated feature, from layout to animation to special effects and so on. As opposed to previous animation tours in various American parks, this tour will focus not only on hand-drawn animation, but also on computer animation. The last major area inside is Olaf Draws, and this is pretty much the newest and most updated version of the Animation Academy, only leading the class is not a cast member, but instead an animatronic of Olaf, who is assisted via recorded video by some key Disney animators. Presumably, the teaching animators who again appear on screen, as well as the characters they present, will change throughout the day. And then the exit corridor has some character portraits that come to life, but the exit corridor primarily leads guests out to the studio store. But to get back to the courtyard itself, as this is what is presently open, together the icons here are arranged to make the animation courtyard an amalgam of the largest 3 places for Disney animation in California during the 20th century. And if you want to add in a 4th location, the actual area here itself was the location for the Florida Walt Disney Features Animation Studio that existed right here between 1989 and 2004, which was a production location for such films as Mulan, Lilo and Stitch, Brother Bear, among others. So the space for the actual studio that once existed here remains part of the area. But at least in the outdoor courtyard, there aren't new flourishes that visually point to the old Florida studio, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are nods to the Florida studio arranged in the indoor tour, the one that's not yet open. And if that's true, the area would then have visual and geographic connections to the 4 large centers for Disney animation in America during the 20th century. Overall, this is a really nice collection of placemaking materials. The courtyard now gives this corner of the park a definable identity. By far the largest number of visual nods in the courtyard are directed at the Burbank studio, the one that Walt knew in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. To the left of the animation courtyard is Walt Disney Presents, which is a small, walkable museum that celebrates the life of Walt Disney and is largely focused on his mid-century experience in California. And to the right of the animation courtyard is the Hollywood Brown Derby, which is a recreation of an actual set of restaurants that once existed around Hollywood and had its heyday in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So this corner of the park, in terms of its timeline and identity, is thematically focused now mostly on Walt Disney and Los Angeles during the golden age of Hollywood. And again, maybe there's some more connections to the Florida Animation Studio once the indoor portions are opened. But now that we've laid out the markers that point to Disney animation history in California, let's take a look at some of the whimsical elements that have also been layered into this courtyard. First of all, the area is dressed with permanent figures, essentially small statues, from Disney animated films. Along the chrome trim that edges the upper portions of the buildings, and it's the same chrome trim that's been on these buildings for decades, you can now find some small Disney stars, such as Timothy the Mouse from Dumbo positioned beside Gus and Jock the mice from Cinderella. Apu from Aladdin sticks his curious head through the O in the studio store sign, and for clarity the store is not yet open. And then over on the pergola up top are Sir Hiss from Robin Hood beside Frou Frou, and that is Mr. Big's Arctic Shrew daughter in Zootopia. while down on the artificial grass are Lucifer the cat from Cinderella, Thumper from Bambi, Pua from Moana, and so on. And at the back of the courtyard are cement squares where, presumably, characters have signed their names and left their hand or paw prints, or in the case of Ursula, tentacle prints. But beyond the permanent statuettes of Disney characters, the most significant element was how live characters were being used, such as Pluto, Donald, Chip and Dale, Rapunzel, and so on. Starting last summer, Disney World began to shift how character interactions were arranged in its parks. For the past 3 decades, Disney World has focused character interactions in the parks largely in structured meet and greets. Initially started with Mickey's Birthday Land, which was in the Magic Kingdom. This was initially supposed to be a temporary land to celebrate Mickey's 60th birthday in the late 1980s, and in it there were themed meet and greet spaces for various characters. Before this, characters often roamed the parks for casual, random, and spontaneous interactions with guests. But after the success of the themed meet and greets in Mickey's Birthday Land, structured meet and greets slowly became the norm at Disney World, a change that was solidified when Disney started to add these meet and greets to the list of Fast Pass attractions. But the downside, at least for me, of these meet and greet locations are that they often feel staged and rehearsed. They are often focused on PhotoPass photographers snapping photos, and the lines for these structured meet and greet areas could be very long. For about a year now, Disney has been trying to undo some of this, adding less structured opportunities for guests, particularly for kids, to meet the characters in an environment of unscripted play. When I was in Animation Courtyard, and admittedly this was during opening weekend, so everything during that time was going to be in tip-top shape, as multiple managers were there to supervise every last detail, there were 6 characters out at the same time talking to and playing with younger guests. This felt more natural and enjoyable, in my opinion, than the formal meet and greet locations. It's also a way to make the parks into places where the characters actually live. Or to put it this way, this is a way to refocus what the parks actually offer so that it's centered more on the needs and interests of families with younger children. And this also is a nod toward middle-class families with limited vacation budgets. The other place that for years had character interactions were inside of character meals, which generally run between $50 and $60 a person. Those character meals are still at the resort, but similar experiences of character play, the type of play that regularly happens at those character meals, now is starting to happen in the parks without the hefty character meal price tag. Characters are also starting to visit certain resorts, and surprisingly, the scheduled appearances of Mickey, Minnie, and others are not at the deluxe resorts. They're all at lower-priced resort hotels that are directed toward younger middle-class families, which include Art of Animation, Pop Century, Caribbean Beach, and Port Orleans. When my kids were young, early years of elementary school, we stayed at Pop on many visits. And to demonstrate that Pop is a place for middle-class families, I just plugged in dates and various discounts on weekdays this summer. You can get a room at Pop for $158 per night. And in Disney's economy, that is squarely intended for middle-class families. So the shift here to take characters out of paid experiences or structured meet and greet areas is a nod toward spontaneity on one hand, and also a nod toward middle-class families with limited vacation budgets on the other. But to get back to the through line here, this shift back to how characters appear in the parks and also at some hotels now is also a shift back to how characters originally worked at Disney World and is a nod to those more natural and inviting experiences that regularly happened here in the 1970s and 1980s. Having them moving through the animation courtyard removes the barrier of either standing in a fairly long line for a meet and greet area or paying for an expensive meal simply to meet the characters. Instead, the animation courtyard is a space that feels far more like an inviting area where kids are being entertained in the domain of characters they know from TV and film, and the parks now are being the places where those characters live and play out in the open. Later this summer, as I mentioned, the animation courtyard will be joined by a set of indoor experiences. But for right now, the animation courtyard is itself absolutely lovely. But we'll have to wait a few more months until those indoor experiences join the area to finish the overall design of this section of the revised park. And rounding things out today is our final segment, which is mostly focused on the Carousel of Progress. About a year ago, at Destination D in Florida, Disney announced that an animatronic of Walt Disney was coming to the Carousel of Progress, much like the one that was presently in the Opera House at Disneyland. The new version of the Walt animatronic would be dressed up in a blue cardigan sweater to resemble how he appeared on one of his Sunday night TV episodes called Disneyland Goes to the World's Fair, where he talked about the Disney-developed attractions, including Carousel of Progress, that would then appear at the 1964 New York World's Fair. At the time of this announcement at Destination D, Disney Imagineers presented the Walt animatronic as a replacement for the opening moments of the show's current stage, specifically the scene in which the name of the attraction appears on stage, while voiceover narration relates the history of the show. But there's now a lot more going on with this attraction in terms of updates. It's not just one stage that will be redone, but pretty much the entire attraction. But before we get to those specific changes that are coming to the Carousel of Progress, let me tell you what this announcement likely reveals. Tropical Americas is likely not opening for the summer 2027 season. As I've mentioned previously, I think winter 2027 is the earliest possible date based on what I've seen in terms of construction. And again, as I've mentioned, maybe that Encanto ride doesn't make that date as well, so the land could open with just the Indie ride, the Carousel, and the other elements of Tropical Americas. So, and I think this has been clear for a while, Disney needs another set of attraction refreshes or redos so the resort can promote itself for its spring or more likely summer 2027 season. And this here is where the Carousel of Progress announcement likely comes into play. A remade Carousel of Progress is something that the resort can promote in the middle of 2027. Also, I'm guessing there will be at least one and hopefully a couple more announcements similar to this, in which existing attractions are updated, again as a way to anchor promotions in the mid part of 2027, similar to what is happening right now, with Smuggler's Run featuring Mando, Rock and Roller Coaster with the Muppets, Soaring Across America, and so on. Attractions can be redone in under a year, but substantial new attractions cannot be built in that short time frame. The current version of Carousel of Progress now has a closing date of July 5th. That's a month from now, which should place the yet-to-be-announced reopening date for this attraction around mid-2027. So let's say in what I will call the original version of Carousel of Progress, this attraction tracks how electrical conveniences improve the home life of John, Sarah, Rover, their kids, and the rest of the extended family. Mostly over the first half of the 20th century, The current stages, the ones that are in the attraction right now, are themed to the 1900s, then the 1920s, then the late 1940s, and then jump into an unnamed year in the future. I'm pretty sure that you, as part of this podcast audience, have seen this attraction, at least a video of it, so I probably don't need to explain it. Previously, when this attraction has been refreshed, and there have been 3 significant refreshes here, the major changes have been focused on the final scene to move the details of that stage further into the future. The current version of the final stage takes place during Christmas time as the family discusses laser discs and virtual reality and a smart oven. All things that today feel a whole lot more like the recent past than the near future. This time, the entire attraction is being redone, from the first stage to the last. Instead of focusing on the turn of the century, then the 1920s, and then the 1940s, on those first 3 narrative stages, the attraction will now start in the 1960s, specifically on the night of the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969, and from there, time will move forward. After the Apollo 11 sequence, the next stage shifts to the mid-1980s on the night of Halloween. And here on that 1980s stage, there's another change in terms of the show's presentation format. Whereas in the original Carousel of Progress, the father, that's John, narrates the life of the family, in the new version, both mother and father, that is Sarah and John, share the role of narrating. And the 1980s Halloween sequence is focused on Sarah. After the 1980s comes the countdown to Y2K, specifically New Year's Eve 1999, leading into the new century. And after that, the final stage is set much further into the future than any previous update. I'm pretty sure that this is so the revised attraction doesn't need to be revised again for a couple of decades. As you imagine what might be on that final stage, think about the old Epcot attraction Horizons, which looked at the future many decades from the present. Specifically on the last stage of the soon-to-be redone Carousel of Progress, John and Sarah's family will be living on another planet, something far beyond Earth. And by updating all of these elements, the attraction is entirely reset with how it relates to audiences. Back in the 1960s, when the Carousel of Progress premiered at the World's Fair, now, how should I put this? Seasoned Americans over the age of 65 had lived through all of the decades represented in the attraction. And starting in 2027, the same will again be true. Those seasoned Americans, again people who are probably 65 and up, will likely have clear memories of each decade presented on stage. So in this way, the revised attraction better involves the actual audience that is coming to Disney World, and may even be an opportunity for grandparents, after visiting the attraction, to relate what they remember of those eras to their grandchildren. So this will play into a strong sense of personal nostalgia that some guests bring with them into the parks and then possibly can share with those that are visiting the parks with them. From the artwork and how Imagineers described what would be built, it looks like the stage layout for each sequence will remain roughly the same. That is, how those stages are blocked out. The layout of the first 3 narrative stages will have central areas for the main drama, with 2 turntable stages hidden behind scrims in the corners. And it also looks like some elements will be repurposed into this revised attraction. For example, Uncle Orville will still be in his bathtub, and Grandmother will be watching TV, though this time it will be pro wrestling. And the last stage, just as it is now, will be entirely open from side to side, with no turntable stages in the corners. Imagineering is also planning to refresh and not necessarily replace many of the current animatronics. And that part for me is a little bit of a disappointment, as these are the earliest human animatronics in any of the parks. These figures slightly predate the original Disney version of Lincoln, and most have very limited ranges of movement. It does seem the show will need a new animatronic to Sarah to narrate her scene in the 1980s, and there is a moment on the final stage where the grandparents, having just arrived, enter the house, and those figures as well will likely be new. It's looking more like the other figures will mostly be freshened up, but it would be fabulous if WDI at least swapped out some of the early animatronic systems, which on the Carousel are largely made up of hydraulic actuators, for more modern electronic systems with a greater fluidity of movement. Hopefully at least the figure who narrates each stage will be redone with more modern systems, something that might better match the movement of the new Walt Disney animatronic on the show's introductory stage. So this revised Carousel of Progress will be one updated attraction that Disney can use for promotion in mid-2027. Again, I'm guessing that we'll see one or hopefully two more refreshed attractions announced sometime soon with similar opening timelines. Specifically, the Florida resort needs more around which to bring guests to the parks next summer. And here I'll take some random guesses. At the Magic Kingdom, the ride that most needs to be mechanically updated is Space Mountain, but that will take more than a year. So on my list of realistic options are Laugh Floor and Speedway. At Epcot, the ride that most needs to be updated is Journey into Imagination, but that too should take more than a year if it's done right. So on my list of realistic options is mostly Spaceship Earth, which can be updated in under a year. I think Hollywood Studios is going to hold steady with the revamped attractions already in place and coming soon to the park. And at Animal Kingdom, I think they might hold steady as well, as the first new land will appear there, also presumably in 2027, and also as Conservation Station was just redone and just opened this past week. I've been out there and we'll talk about that next time. But if there is one attraction at Animal Kingdom that does get some love and an update, my money would be on Kelly River Rapids, particularly with updated show scenes that better tie the ride to its surrounding area, which is themed to Asia. But again, I am hopeful that there will be one or two more refreshes to be announced for 2027, simply to allow the Disney marketing machine to move forward in promoting the Florida resort next year. And maybe this announcement, or optimistically, these announcements are made at the Expo in August. And let me add one last thing here to close all of this up. On the one hand, it's disappointing that Disney World won't be opening any large and fully new attractions in 2026 or for most of 2027, which was also exactly what happened in 2025. But on the other hand, what I might now call the Bob Chapek fallout has forced Disney to update many key attractions that have needed love and attention for many years. This was the only practical way to make the parks at the Florida resort seem new. And in those small ways, the Florida resort is starting to look better, with some tired attractions all dressed up and looking pretty young again. I'll be back next week with a new episode. The plan right now is to continue exploring some of the recent changes out at the Florida resort. Lastly, if you've been enjoying this podcast on Apple or Spotify or one of the many other public feeds, we would love to have you join us as a subscriber over on Bandcamp. On Spotify and the other public outlets, you will find 100 episodes, but on Bandcamp you'll find over 400, including mini albums that collect up our longer series into multi-hour presentations. The best reason, however, to become a monthly subscriber is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes today. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.